Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today about legal problems facing trans people in Niagara. My name is Sarah Webster. I'm knowledge broker for Niagara Connects, and we also have from our team today Sarah Johnston, who's acting as chairperson in the online meeting room. The audio for this webinar obviously is provided through the phone, but please do make sure that you've also clicked the web link to join us in the online meeting room so that you'll be able to see the slides today. We do have all the participant lines muted, and this just kind of helps us cut down on any inevitable background noise that happens, and also allows those that are joining in small groups to have any sidebar conversations. So please do feel free to use the chat pod down the left-hand side of your screen if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, and certainly we'll be saving time for discussion at the end of the presentation today. We also do record all of our webinars. So we will be sending you a link within about a week. A resource package will come to you, and that'll have a link to a PDF of the slides, a link to the recording, and any other related material. And we encourage you to share that with any other colleagues who might be interested in the content but just not able to join us today. So that's all from me. I'm going to turn it over now to our presenter, Dr. Julie James, Assistant Professor in Child and Youth Care at Ryerson University. So Julie, take us away.
Hi, thanks Sarah. That's wonderful. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and hello everybody. It's a little bit odd for me to be talking to some people where you're not talking back and I can't see you, but I hope everybody's doing really well. I'm talking to you from Ryerson in Toronto, and it's quite warm here, so we're quite happy about that. So I'm going to tuck in because we don't have that much time, but we do have quite a bit of material to cover, quite a lot for me to share. So right there, that's our first slide. So that's just our slide logo, and the name of our study is Transforming Justice, and it's a trans legal needs assessment in Ontario. So it's the first of its kind study to be done in Ontario. It's the second province-wide study of the trans population to be conducted province-wide, and it's the largest study done globally. It's actually the first legal needs assessment done in partnership with academic institutions on the trans community done ever, actually. What our study is, we're a province-wide study of the social and legal service needs of trans people in Ontario. Our eligibility is 16 years and older, Ontario residents, and identify as trans. And we are funded through Legal Aid Ontario, HTN, partnered with the University of Toronto, Western, and Ryerson. And the impetus of the project began when the executive director of HALCO, that's our HIV/AIDS legal aid clinic in Ontario, Ryan Peck, talked to Nicole Nussbaum, who's a trans-identified lawyer and advocate, and said to Nicole, why aren't we seeing more trans folks come through the door? What are we doing that's not eliciting their service? And what Nicole said is, you know what, it's not just you. We don't think trans folks are accessing services, medical, legal, social, or otherwise, but we have an understanding that they're probably dealing with high levels of discrimination and legal concerns. So let's figure out what's going on overall, and let's start to document what's happening so we understand how to serve the trans population better. So our team is consisted of Nicole Nussbaum, who's a lawyer that has done a ton of advocacy work, both nationally and internationally. She just got back from Peru. Ryan Peck, who's the executive director of HALCO. Dr. David Brennan from the University of Toronto. Dr. Greta Bauer, you might recognize her if you know trans research. Greta Bauer was the principal investigator for the Trans Pulse study. And then there's me from Ryerson University. So our advisory committees, just to give you some context, was made up of 4 advisory committees. We had the Trans Community Committee, of which we met with and did focus groups and talked extensively with in terms of how we approach the study and what we're going to ask on the study, what's relevant to the community. We had a Social Service Provider Committee made up of mainly executive directors of social service agencies across the province. We had the Legal Service Provider Committee made up of 17, also sometimes leaders in the field of lawyers across the province, and then we had 14 judges and adjudicators across the province as well. And they all helped us advise on what to ask from a service end point of view, from a community point of view, and helped us access different participants. So we had an online survey. It was quite extensive. The online survey was 90 pages. It mirrors the length of the Trans Pulse survey. And so I'm really grateful that we had as many folks fill it out as they did, because we didn't have enough funding to have an honoraria, and we had a lot of folks do the online survey in response to understanding that there is a need for us to understand what's going on with the community, to be updated about what the community looks like right now, and also some of the issues that they're facing so that we can be better informed as service providers in providing care. When we see the two numbers, the first number is 232 started the survey, and 182 completed all sections. Some of the sections that weren't completed were on the optional part of the survey that talked about in more depth the legal experiences that you may have had. We had trans focus groups across the province. We had 10, so we had 90 participants in that, and then we had 3 specialized focus groups. We had a Two-Spirit Trans focus group, a Racialized Trans focus group, and an HIV-impacted Trans focus group. And then we also met with service providers, legal service providers, and we had 9 groups. And after each of the focus groups, both the trans group and the legal service provider group, we held workshops. For the trans community, we held a workshop on accessing your rights as a trans person. And after the legal service provider group, we held workshops on trans competency in providing legal service. And then we did 19 one-to-one interviews on HIV-impacted trans individuals with a total participant of 440 folks. So there's the timelines when we did this, ending all data collection in February 2017, and since then we've been analyzing the data and trying to get the knowledge out there. The key objectives for the study were to document the experiences of discrimination. So we knew anecdotally that the trans population was dealing with quite high levels of discrimination. We just didn't have those formally documented, and we didn't have like the context in which those experiences took place. We don't know how to help or serve those things. We also wanted to look at for barriers and facilitators in terms of accessing justice. So what is preventing trans folks from getting legal support and social service support, and then what are the things that help overcome those barriers? And then we wanted to lead to recommendations. So we want concrete recommendations on how we can move forward with this. So just sort of quickly, we come from an access to justice framework that looks at these different types of barriers. We also look at different things around demographic information, employment information, updating what the community in Ontario looks like. So we document quite a lot. In terms of the reports, there are a number of reports proposed. The first report is the one that I'm going to be talking about. So the legal burdens for the trans community. The report has been written. It's almost edited, and it's being sent for translation, and probably in the new year it's going to be publicly released. The second report we're working on currently talks about the barriers and facilitators to social and legal services for trans people. So that one's a bit more of a toolkit in terms of what's preventing access to justice and how we overcome that. The third one is around needs of legal service providers in particular. And those are our 3 substantive public reports. Also, in these areas, there's a number of academic journals that can be written, that are being written as well. Then we have a number of issue-specific reports. And I want to alert you all to this because these are the things that are being worked on sort of simultaneously by different folks. For example, we have 2 people working on the criminal law, police, sex work, and prison experience is one now. I'm working on the youth-led one, and also the family law one, and a number of people are working on the health one and the HIV-related legal issues. So as those reports become available by different teams working on them, they'll be released publicly. But I put them out there, so if there's any issues that you're sort of interested in, certainly contact me, and we can flesh out some of those things and make sure they have access to those things. Okay, so this is more interesting to me at the moment. I'm interested in who's on the call. So if you could take a moment to answer where you're sort of coming from. Are you a community member, social service provider, legal service provider, medical service provider, an advocate, other? That would really help me in terms of tailoring how I sort of present the remaining information. Okay. Community members, hi, great. Social service providers, I have a background in social work, so nice to see you there. Nice to see an advocate. Great. And some other folks, so I needed more categories there. Social service providers, great. Oh, and a medical service provider, fantastic. All right, so social service providers. The other category I'm sort of interested in what that might represent, but that gives me some indication of how to talk about these things going forward. So thank you for that. All right, so the next poll that I want to ask you about is which area are you most interested in? So I'll spend a little more time in the areas that you're most interested in. Employment, housing, experiences with police, discrimination, or HIV impact. Looks like all areas so far. Oh, discrimination, yep. Okay. All right. So I will spend a good amount of time with each of those areas and focus on experiences of discrimination, unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, there's a number of examples there. All right, and the next one is that I do have information about the Ontario community as a whole, and then I have information about the Niagara-Hamilton community. Would you like me to focus on Ontario and Niagara, or mostly sort of focus my information on Niagara-Hamilton? Okay. Okay, so a completely even split. Okay, I can definitely accommodate that. Wonderful. Okay. So going forward, just so you know, in terms of eligibility for our overall definition of trans, we used the definition that's in the Human Rights Code of Ontario. That's quite a big umbrella term, and we were really looking for those who self-identify as trans, which can have, as a lot of us are aware, can be a diverse array of experiences and identities. So just to overview a little bit, and this is also in terms of like what you might expect going forward and areas that you might be interested in. In terms of our survey, it was quite extensive. We had 6 sections. The first section talked about me, and it was 23 pages on what we call demographic data and well-being data. So we asked about identity, we asked about anxiety, we asked about well-being, we asked about employment and status, education status, that sort of thing. So there's quite a lot of information in there. Section B talks about accessing legal information and supports. I will touch on that a little bit in relation to Niagara, and that's around being, a barrier facilitator in terms of being able to access information and access the supports you need to go through the legal system. Section C is kind of one of my favorites in the way it talks about your views as legal system. So that talks about what we would call attitudinal barriers or facilitators. What are the views that you think about the legal system? Do you feel it's fair? Do you feel it's not fair? And we used known scales and measures to make sure that we access that information in valid and reliable ways. The part that I'm going to focus on today is Section D. And Section D, in a large part of the survey, is modeled after a study that was done nationwide from the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice on justiciable legal problems. So what happened there is that there was a phone survey that took place across Canada that asked people in Ontario what they experienced, what legal problems they may have experienced in a recent 3-year time frame. And what we did is we took the exact same questions that they asked and we put them into the survey. And what we wanted to do there is we wanted to compare the general Canadian population to the trans population in Ontario and see what the comparison is. And so in this, we ask about different legal problems and specific criteria around legal problems, and specifically what we call justiciable legal problems, and in that means legal actionable problems. We also ask, and it's really important, about the impact of these legal problems and getting assistance with these legal problems. And when we ask about the impact of these legal problems, we frame it in terms of costs. And why that's important in this context in particular is that often there is a bit of a problematic conflation of trans identities being conflated with mental health issues. In this, what we're trying to understand is the connection between experiences of legal problems and discrimination and the impact upon well-being in particular, that particular correlation. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we ask about all these different areas as well. It's a very comprehensive section, just so you know. And that, go back, that takes us to page 63. Still grateful that folks filled out the survey. And then we did have an optional section, Section E and Section F, that got into more in-depth about these legal issues. Here's the web-based page that we had that the folks logged on to gain online access to our survey. We also had a paper format survey for those who wish to do that, and also it was translated in French on the paper. So in terms of who took our survey, we had these demographics for all folks that took our survey. So we had a fairly even split between trans women, trans men, and non-binary. As a lot of folks may or may not know, there's always a lot of contention around how we, document trans identities. And so what we put in there, and Greta helped advise this, instead of discrete boxes, what we talked about was we did have, an option in terms of writing in your identity as well, which is really important. We looked at sort of scales, so on the trans feminine scale, trans masculine scale, or the non-binary scale. So there was a bit of an even split that way. In terms of demographics around racialization and indigeneity, we had the survey was disproportionately white. It was one of the things that we were concerned about in terms of getting more recruitment for racialized and Indigenous folks onto the survey. And we hired 2 recruiters that were community identified and connected to help increase that. And we did see some increase in that in terms of our focus group and interview participants. So that's the breakdown in terms of Indigenous participants, non-Indigenous white, and non-Indigenous racialized. In terms of our focus group, there's all the places that we went across the province. We did hold the 3 specialized focus groups in Toronto, the 2 Spirit, Racialized, and HIV-impacted. And in each of the places that we went to for the trans population, we also held a legal service provider focus group. And we tried to do it where we'd meet with the trans community first, and then the legal service providers the following day, so that we can provide some local information to our legal service providers of what's happening with the trans community in their area. And that's a map of all the places we went. And then finally, we had 19 one-to-one interviews for HIV-impacted individuals. And we had a really tough time recruiting for the HIV part of the study in terms of participants. We were advised that level of stigmatization of being trans and then having HIV on top of that was quite intense, and folks who are dealing with being HIV impacted and were trans were much more socially isolated, so it was a bit difficult. We opened up the definition to include HIV positive status, a partner's positive, sex work, intravenous drug use, and experiences of incarceration. And what this did with the interviews is that it actually opened up to have a bit more participation by our youth and our street-involved youth because of the opening of the definition. I think in particular there was some discussion around intravenous drug use in terms of obtaining hormones on the street. And so, findings overall, and in particular to today's topic about legal problems. So overall, and there is no statistical difference between the Ontario population generally and the population within the Niagara-Hamilton region. So what we find overall in relation to legal problems is that trans individuals experience justiciable legal problems in far greater proportion than the general Canadian population within a recent 3-year time window. There was some discussion that if we even went historically, that number would probably be even greater. To obtaining formal, so legal social assistance for these legal problems was very rare. So that was both when support was sought, it could be denied, and often support was not sought, or there was a disengagement. So there was a connection to the service and then a disengagement for different reasons. And then, perhaps not surprisingly, all of this has a profound impact on well-being. So in terms of what that looks like on an overall graphic slide, legal problems in the past 3 years. For those who answered that part of the survey, almost 200 folks, we see a great disproportion. And so I'm going to talk about the first, the 5 highest legal problems, the ones that are most salient, most significant. So they look like this. So the white bar indicates the trans population percentage dealing with that problem, and the blue bar indicates the general Canadian population percentage dealing with that legal problem. So there it looks like in numbers. So we can see that discrimination We had 43% of trans folks within within a recent 3-year time window, so from 2013 2016. 43% were dealing with at least one justiciable legal problem around discrimination. The general Canadian population that's 5.3%, and then it goes down into each category, and I'll go through each of those categories briefly. One of the things to sort of highlight, I'm just going to is the one around employment. The discrepancy doesn't seem to be that large, but there might be a reason. We might have some reason to believe that the number is actually higher than that. And so these numbers from the general Canadian population are from the results of the survey that I talked about in the beginning. Another important issue to highlight is that 71% of trans participants experienced at least one justiciable problem within a 3-year time frame, 2013 to 2016, with 18%, that's almost 20%, having 5 or more different legal problems. And that we found that often we had legal problems that triggered a number of other legal problems. So if you're having a legal issue in relation to employment, then that can trigger issues around housing, or they can be connected and combined. And this part is just a word. So what happens if we want to visually represent what's happening with our qualitative data? So all the information that we gathered in our focus groups and interviews, they let you do a little word thing that shows you the bigger words, the ones that are used more often within our focus group and interviews. Trans, just people, that the humanity around trans folks being respected was a continual theme. Okay, so in terms of discrimination, so our definition is the same that the general population study used, and we do add in gender identity and expression underneath there as well. So discrimination because of any of these reasons. And then we have this discrepancy. And so a lot of things happened in terms of different themes around this, right? So there was a lot of discussion around being denied housing, shelter space, consumer services, police protection, healthcare, addiction treatment, employment, overall because they're trans. And sometimes this was explicit. There was a lot more stories, I think, than we anticipated, where folks were explicitly told, we will not rent to someone who's trans. You cannot be in this shelter space. You have to leave. Being denied customer services, and being fired or not being given employment because explicitly being told because you are trans. Other folks talked about harassment and violence specifically related to from service providers, unfortunately, and service users. So going into service use space, experiencing verbal harassment, and also from service providers, but also service users in the space, issuing verbal harassment often and or sometimes following folks out of the space, and creating an unsafe environment in the community. And there was also a lot of discussion around implicit forms of trans-specific discrimination, so involving denial of all those things after one's trans identity was revealed, and change in sort of behavior towards that person. In terms of racialized folks, and I'll just touch on this sort of briefly, there is this all sort of intensified in terms of frequency, and it also experiences of discrimination. And there was a discussion around, not necessarily being able to unpack one's racial identity, but from one's trans identity, in terms of understanding what was sort of the source or cause. And this is sort of similar to talk around discrimination in general around the trans communities. Sometimes it was explicit, sometimes it was sort of just felt, and they had a hard time identifying it. In terms of our racialized participants, there was a lot of talk about some communities being isolated sometimes from their communities of origin, and because they're trans, and so they had experienced this issue where they would not be able to be protected from racialization because of their trans identity. There's also some discussion of not wanting to use community-specific resources if their community of origin was transphobic, because sometimes those communities can be quite tight-knit and their identity would be outed more easily. There were certainly increased discussions around police interactions and surveillance. Our Two-Spirit trans participants talked quite a bit about experiences of transphobia around and the impact of colonization and certain interpretations of Christianity on and off reserve. A lot of Two-Spirit folks talked about coming to urban spaces to try to seek shelter, but unfortunately experiencing more violence in these spaces. And then our HIV-impacted trans folks talked quite a bit about having the stigma of HIV layered onto their identities, and having access to healthcare was a big problem. And also there was discussion around social factors around being trans and related to increased risk of HIV around socialization, lack of access to medical treatment and care, and experiencing transphobic motivated assault. So in terms of medical treatment, a lot of the medical treatment, and there's a definition there, and the slides will be made available. A lot of it is about access or treatment while in hospital, but also treatment or harm may be done while under the care of a physician. And there was a lot of stories about seeking urgent care when folks wanted to seek urgent care, and having lengthy delays in hospital settings because the staff were unsure of what to do with the person around being trans, or there was an undue focus on the trans identity. Folks talked about experiences in healthcare spaces around being outed consistently when their legal name didn't match the name, their preferred name. And sometimes there was even like technical glitches when the legal name was changed, but there was a medical history involving the legal name, and the folks would be out in those spaces, which they talked about in terms of feeling unsafe then, as well as the impact of being misgendered. There was also a lot of talk around just access to primary health care and being denied that from service providers as well. In terms of employment, so we're talking about being dismissed, unfairly disciplined, harassment, those sorts of things, health or safety issues. So one of the things that I want to point out here is that our survey did not ask about obtaining employment. So we asked about once you were employed, did you experience these issues? Or after you were employed, did you experience these issues? We didn't ask about the process of interviewing or being granted an interview or what happens at the interview stage. When we got to the focus groups, we heard a lot of stories around being denied employment in the first place, sometimes very explicitly with statements saying we will not hire a trans person, very explicitly. Sometimes everything seemed to be going very well, and then as soon as their trans identity was revealed, they didn't have the job offer anymore. And so we suspect that that number is quite a bit higher for the trans population if we were to factor in the interview or obtaining employment process. Several folks talked about harassment on the job and not getting support for that. And then housing, and in particular in Niagara-Hamilton area, this was seen as a huge issue. So we have a number of trans folks identifying in Ontario that housing or being denied housing was an issue that they were dealing with. Again, outright being told that someone would not rent to a trans person, experiencing mistreatment with other residents in their own housing units, being evicted during transition. One of the things that the coping measures that we found was that some trans folks would band together and create sort of a trans family, or have at least one person try to pass as cisgendered in order to obtain housing, or if they had obtained housing before transition, what they would tend to do afterwards is lay low and hide their trans identities for fear of eviction. But what sometimes this meant is that folks were living with unsafe and unsanitary conditions because they didn't want to approach their landlord. And then there's police action, so discrimination, assault, failure to perform duties, failure to protect or intervene. So we heard stories about all of those things. harassment, assault, blaming the trans person for their victimization. There's a number of stories about police watching discrimination or street violence or harassment happen and not intervening or not taking the problem seriously. So perhaps unsurprisingly, all of this has a toll on one's well-being. So in relation to these legal issues in particular, it was reported that 66% experienced mental health and emotional problems related to their legal issues. 51% experienced social and family problems. For example, folks would talk about being denied housing for 6 months and that having a strain on their relationship, amongst other things. And then 29% reported having physical health issues. And so that's what that percentage looked like for the trans population in terms of experiencing the costs of having these legal issues. And that's the breakdown. So in terms of the Niagara and Hamilton region in particular, and I don't have the numbers and I can't verify for you right now. I need to have them checked. But it looks like what we have is that in your area, there's a high percentage that had high school and some university education. So we're looking at a fairly highly educated population. However, the income range was between $5,000 to $20,000 a year, or less than $5,000 to $25,000 a year. There seems to be a fairly high percentage of domestic violence experienced by trans folks in this region. And the trans-specific violence, discrimination, harassment, all from that region who answered the survey reported experiencing those things that were trans-specific at some point. There was some discrepancy around amount and frequency, with some folks reporting quite a bit more of that frequency, and there seems to be some correlation between being trans and racialized and experiencing more trans-specific violence. In terms of the beliefs in the legal system, there was a strong agreement that amongst the trans folks from that region that the system favors rich and cisgendered people. In terms of also looking at accessing supports in the region, folks answered that they strongly agree that they would feel safe as a strongly disagreed, that they would feel safe as a trans person accessing legal services. They disagreed that there were supports in the area for trans people to access legal services. They strongly disagreed that they would have access to transportation. Transportation kept on coming up as a big issue to access services, and they strongly disagreed that they would have time to go through a legal process. On the survey, so some identified no legal problems at all, so within a 3-year time frame, no justiciable legal problems. But those who did identify with legal problems had multiple legal problems, so 5 or more were identified. And there, again, appears to be a connection between having multiple legal problems and being trans, and also dealing with the intersections of racialization, being young, and a correlation to non-binary status. In terms of our focus groups, there was a lot of discussion, a common theme around a lack of training and awareness for public services. So there was a really big focus or discussion around feeling safe or feeling rather unsafe within the larger community. So going into consumer spaces or community spaces or library, or going into banking or government offices and security guards. So being out in the community was discussed a lot as something that was problematic and unsafe, and feeling that those professionals that they interact with just have an unawareness and a lack of training about trans folks in general. And so a lot of people talked about being really terrified to even walk into a business space or walk in public. And they developed some coping mechanisms, right? And they talked about being assaulted or experiencing violent or public harassment. And so sometimes, they would pretend that they were videotaping walking home. Some folks had to learn to appear intimidating, or often, which is not uncommon to your region, the strategy was to not go out in public as much as possible. There was a sentiment that they felt more vulnerable in public spaces because it was a smaller town or rural space. And there were a number of experiences of violence, harassment at work, with some folks quitting for their own safety. There was, and this is not necessarily uncommon to this region, but low confidence in reporting to police. There was a lot of previous experience of being inhumanely handled, with some call and some good experiences with crisis intervention trained officers being preferred and them having more knowledge and training. They had experience of being blamed for their own victimization by police as well. There was also talk about lack of awareness and training on parts of security guards or police, and having a situation happen and the security guard police not knowing how to intervene and not knowing what to do with a trans identified person, and so sometimes just dropping the case and not pursuing things. There was talk about being misgendered on purpose, intentionally and repeatedly, and a feeling that there was increased surveillance on trans people in the area by police. So housing was a huge issue discussed, and a lot of folks took up to 6 months to find housing, if at all. Blatantly, many were told that they would not, that the landlord would not rent to a trans person. Several had been kicked out of shelter space for being trans, talking about living under poverty, that they can only afford one room in a house, but there was a lot of concern around what would the neighbors within that housing space be like, would they be safe? And having a huge impact on relationships and staying together. And then the other bit was around all of these issues. There's a lot of talk around having social anxiety because of this, and then tending to walk away and not dealing with the issues of violence, discrimination, harassment that they're experiencing. There was discussions around CAS in the area, and trans folks being denied access to their children because of their trans identity, which we have case law saying that can't be the sole reason or can't be our reason at all. And we had issues talked around youth in the area, not knowing where to place youth that come from transphobic homes that are over the age of 16, and service folks trying to find crash beds, but ultimately returning young people to their homes that are transphobic and or violent. And so the overall advice is that, and this was actually a common theme throughout the focus groups, was recognize your humanity in this area in particular, really get training and awareness of trans issues, talking about reducing the cost or getting help for name changes, and then advertising that you're trans friendly. So then we met with the lawyers in the area who, one of the biases we had a little bit with lawyers who came on to the focus groups was that they were actively looking to be trained in this area, and not all lawyers, we understand, are actively looking for training around these issues. And they admitted sort of very readily in the area themselves and other lawyers are just not at all aware of trans people and their issues in general. Only very few had experiences with trans clients. They felt, though, the area would be a very different place to be trans in versus an urban space, and they had noticed and understood some stories around being poor treatment by neighbors, police, and medical people for trans people. There is a sentiment that there was not many trans folks thought to be in the area as compared to Toronto, which is a common sentiment that I've heard in various rural spaces across the province. But what's interesting is that we actually know from Trans Pulse that that's not the case, that there is actually quite a large population of trans folks in rural spaces. The difference is that trans folks, especially in rural spaces, aren't out in the community as much. So there's that isolation factor. And I had a member of legal clinic said to me, well, Julie, I'm not sure if I should, even participate or if I can be helpful because we just simply don't have trans people in our area. And I had just met the night before with the community that's there, basically. And the other sentiment, I'm not even sure they're dealing with legal problems. And so it was a really good sort of connecting piece around to the lawyers in the area who are committed to supporting human rights and looking at areas of discrimination, that yes, you do have a vibrant community there, and they are dealing with quite a few things. So some outreach is really important to do. So the legal folks also recognize that housing is a big issue in your area, and transportation is an enormous issue as well. There was an awareness of trans-specific support services exist and what they might be. They're aware that social services in general exist and what those ones are, but there was experiences of very long wait lists. And there was an understanding, sort of an awareness that trans population may have very low confidence in legal service providers and their ability to be trans competent. They, those at the group really expressed an interest to improve and have education in the area. So, in summary, some of the takeaways is that trans folks experience very high rates of legal problems in comparison to the general Canadian population. They rarely receive formal help for these issues, and the impact on well-being is profound. In Niagara area in particular, there's some indication of impact of racialization, youth, and non-binary status on increasing, intensifying some of these elements. In the area as well, employment, housing, and shelter space is a large problem for trans folks. Transportation and social service wait list seems to be a large problem as well. And it looks like awareness, training, education for legal service providers, social service providers, and police, medical personnel, and mental health professionals on trans issues is strongly needed. Okay, so that's a lot from me. Hopefully I didn't talk too quickly. So I'm wondering if there's any questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Julie, for that. A lot of information to take in, but I think some really valuable information, especially with respect specifically to the Niagara community, that can inform decisions going forward. So I open up the floor to those participants joining us today. You can either, if you have any questions for Julie or just general questions or comments, you can either type them in the chat pod on the left-hand side of your screen, or if you'd like to verbally make any comments, you can unmute your own phone line by pressing *7 on your phone.
Yes, thanks. And I realize that was a ton of information to absorb.
Absolutely. Julie, your last comments that you were making with respect to legal service providers, obviously it really strikes me that there is an opportunity there for some education, that when we look at, and that I love hearing about this type of research when there's gaps identified, but when there's really tangible solutions or things we can do to start addressing those gaps. It makes me feel like we're moving forward.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think part of, and I kind of, this report, like the first report's a hard one because it's a bad news story, right? So, so here's all the issues, and so we're starting to get some recommendations. But the second report that we're working on right now really digs deep to that. So those are ones, okay, here's the big problem, here's what we all need to start doing, right?
Right.
So
Ashley, oh, yes, go ahead.
My name is Dick Moore. I work with Senior Pride Network Niagara. I'm curious about the experience of older trans people in the community generally and in seeking and finding long-term care.
Oh, that's
Did you have older participants in your survey?
We did. And you know what? I'm just jotting that down because what I'll do is how it's sort of delegated within our team is that Greta has been sort of managing the quantitative, our survey data, all the numbers, and David and I have been managing the qualitative data. So I've just put it on our list in terms of digging into that and getting some more specific information around our older trans folks, and we did hear from them for sure.
Also related to that is the experience of people who transition later in life compared to people who transition earlier.
Yes, and I'm just writing that down as well. So one of the things we do ask is about, we do ask your age on the survey, and we also ask about transition, right? What year you transitioned, that sort of thing. So some of those are some things that we can look into, and if you want to take down my contact information here, you can stay connected and I can get back to you with some of that specific information for sure.
I think a related issue would have to do with training for service providers for trans people living in the community, people delivering Meals on Wheels, providing home support services, nursing services, the CCAC now, the LIND, and the training it has for its staff and for the people with whom the agencies with whom it contracts in terms of trans awareness training.
I absolutely agree with you. And so one of the things that I was just talking to, I've been talking to different folks in the Toronto area that work with trans folks, and so I'm in the Faculty of Community Services, and so we have social work, we have nursing, we have public health, ECE, child and youth care, which is my area, and I'll be looking at the young population, but in general, what we all need to do, what we're looking at, is infusing in our curriculum and then in training going forward the professionals that are in the community, right? And getting that going, because our health sectors seem to be, starting to really enhance those things. As the legal service providers, we're working on that, and it's really the community and social services that we need to really up. I agree. I definitely agree.
Thank you.
So, Julie, we actually, I have a question here from Ashley, and you might be able to answer it, and or Dick, you might be able to answer as well. So Ashley asks, in the Niagara region, what would you suggest for training for agencies or organizations that are looking for that extra support or information?
I know that Quest Community Services provides some training. Senior Pride Network Niagara has applied for a New Horizons grant to undertake a training capacity within the network. We're not going to hear about whether or not we got that grant until January. Okay. In the meantime, I do some training. I don't claim to be at all experienced and particularly good, and I'm good on general LGBT awareness and older LGBT issues and concerns. I do, of course, touch on trans stuff, and many of the exercises and stuff that are involved in our awareness raising with respect to the trans community. But I don't have a colleague with whom I train who does who is trans, and that's what would be required, I believe.
Right.
Also, the 519 does some training, and they have trans trainers as part of their stable of trainers, and Rainbow Health Ontario also does train. I train with both of those groups as well, but they, I'm sure that both of them have trans people involved in the training, which is critical, of course.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know and then to tack on to that, I know in the future, just coming from Ryerson Community Services, we're looking at building online curriculum and training tools. So those who are, learning to be professionals from our faculty, and then those who are already on the field. That's sort of a future endeavor going forward.
Thank you. There's a question here about if there's specific lawyers, and maybe this isn't, I don't know if you can answer it now, but lawyers in the Hamilton Niagara area that we can recommend to trans individuals.
That's a great question. And I'm going to write this down. And maybe, is there a way that that I can follow up in terms of sending out an email? I'm not sure, because I wanted, so one of the things that we talked about in relation to this is building some sort of resource so that folks know who is developing some trans competency, right? But in terms of this area, the lawyers that attended the workshop afterwards would at least have a desire to be trans competent and had developed, one-on-one skills. So I can connect with Nicole to see if I can create a list of names and maybe hand it over to Quest as a resource. Does that work?
Yeah, I think we can do a couple things. So from Niagara Connect side, we certainly send out in about a week that resource package. So if there's any follow-up to questions that you have answers to by early next week, then if you can connect with me, Julie, we'll include those answers in that resource package. But in terms of kind of future materials such as that contact list, I'm sure Quest would appreciate having it as a resource. And if you can send to us as well, we'll do a second follow-up communication to everyone who's registered for this event so that everyone participating then directly gets that as well.
Sure. And, and then I have to say that if given permission, the lawyers that did attend the workshop that Nicole held seemed quite eager and aware already of certain things. So there might be some good souls to connect with. Yep.
This is Dick Moore again. Rainbow Health Ontario has, as part of its website, a listing of sympathetic service providers that people can go to. And then there's a Rainbow Health. There's another e-list. I can't remember the name of it right now. I've been on it for many years. that people inquire just generally of anybody that's on the list. Do you know a sympathetic lawyer? Do you know a sympathetic social worker, physiotherapist, whatever? But I know that Rainbow Health Ontario has such a resource and would welcome input from you in terms of sympathetic lawyers and whatnot.
Right. Yep.
Thank you. And Julie, do you have on hand the number of legal firms from Niagara and then from Hamilton that were interviewed or participating?
I know. I'm looking at that question. I'm trying to figure out if I'm allowed to answer.
Fair enough.
But we did have at least 2 legal community-based clinics that were involved, and I believe offhand, I think 14 folks participated in the focus group from the area, legal service providers.
Great.
I remembered the name of the network. It's Rainbow Health Network, and it's an e-list of queer folk around the province.
Thank you, Dick.
Yes, Dick, thank you.
I love this kind of information sharing. So I have another question here from Justina saying, what was the nature of issues experienced with respect to receiving health services? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Right. So it sort of ranged across the span. So there was a number of discussions around receiving primary health care and access to primary health care. So, and there's a number of issues around that. One, there was some primary health care physicians that would deny health care service, saying that they weren't trans competent, and sometimes there were issues being presented that had nothing to do with being trans, that primary health care providers didn't feel comfortable or whatever, so they were denied primary health care. We had some intersex folks talk about having issues finding health care at all, because doctors said, especially with intersex identities, that they didn't have competency. And again, even with their issues that had no relationship to that identity, there were issues in healthcare settings around, again, being outed or misgendered was really quite common. There were issues around getting into hospital care and having, for example, a leg injury or being in a car accident, and because the staff on hand didn't know what to do with the trans identity, folks waiting for hours and hours to get treated for something that had nothing, no relationship to their trans identity. There was a lot of unawareness around, a lot of education that had happened to primary caregivers that were engaging in wanting to provide primary care or hormone therapy, that sort of thing. And then there was a ton of discussion, especially in the north, around access to trans-specific healthcare, and that access was really difficult. And getting transportation down to different facilities if you're outside of an urban space, and actually outside of Toronto space or Montreal space in particular, but outside, we were only asking about Ontario, so Toronto space. Even folks in Ottawa or other rural spaces felt that access to trans-related medical care was pretty much non-existent or very difficult.
This is Dick again. Rainbow Health Ontario has done road shows around the province on treating trans people, on prescribing hormones and amounts and relating to trans people and all that sort of stuff. My understanding is that certainly Quest in Regional Niagara does a wonderful job with respect to that, but other physicians are reluctant to even get into the role of prescribing hormones and things because they fear they're going to be overloaded with trans people wanting hormones from them, and then making an imbalance on their practice.
Right. And I mean, and our study is not about physicians, so I can't speak to those things. However, I do know that also with our young trans folks, that there's a number of gender identity clinics or different models popping up across the country, and they're talking about their numbers doubling over in a 2-year period, that there's a great influx. So, and there's, stuff's happening on that end in terms of training as well, right? And also, I want to echo, Rainbow Health is doing a fantastic job of trying to meet these needs, right? And Quest as well, for sure. I've heard lovely things about Quest.
And any other final questions today or comments? Okay.
I know I worked at the 519 when the Trans Pulse project was underway, and I know that the 519 developed some wonderful training tools and trainers in terms of opening up things and making people aware of that. I see a huge gap around here in that generally. That's one of the reasons we've applied to provide some training, but it's huge problem. I just feel somewhat frustrated by it. But here is this obviously desperately needy population. The fact of people being afraid to go out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just think of an older person who is perhaps, frail or disabled in some way. All of that as well. God almighty. Tough stuff.
Right.
Absolutely. And sorry?
Hello, I just wanted to make a comment.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Arlene High from the Adult Learning Center out in Beamsville. We look after the rural areas. We haven't experienced anybody coming into the office. I'm sure that there are people out there who could use our services. So I just wanted to say that this has been very informative, and we're certainly open to people coming in to use our services. So I think from here on in, I might be able to maybe add a little tagline onto our advertising that might LGBTQ people welcome. Is that a proper way to do that?
So and Dick can also comment on this as well. So the things that I heard is that the advertising is great. It's a good start. There is some apprehension to understand that advertising sort of equates to good and sensitive treatments, right?
Yeah,
folks have had
that's the issue.
Yeah, so folks have had experiences where there's different signage and then the treatment's different. A lot of what we heard of, and I think what I'd recommend to our legal clinics as well, is that outreach is really important, right? To connect to community leaders and who are connected to their community, the trans community, and learn, identify, develop those relationships. I think that sort of outward outreach is quite important, and also that indication that folks do care and they're there to help, right? And care
that's
about
the message that I would like to get across.
Yeah.
I suggest just an intervention here. PFLAG in St. Catharines, the Niagara chapter of PFLAG, has recently called together all the LGBTQ groups in the region and published a list with contact names and numbers. You can get that. The woman from Beamsville, it's a very compassionate and wonderful response to this seminar. And that's a resource that you could use in contacting local groups who know the trans community, who might come in and advise you of how things, what appropriate advertising looks like.
Yes.
When I do training about LGBT issues, and I talk about, putting up rainbow flags in your lobby or stickers, rainbow stickers or whatever, it's very important that the person behind the door where the rainbow sticker is on the door be an ally or a trans or LGBT person themselves. And if they're not, if they're either ignorant or opposed to LGBT people, you blow your credibility completely.
That's correct.
In terms of being accessible. So it's good to advertise, but you better be able to deliver if you're going to advertise.
That's right, and I think that's that training piece, and it would be great to have somebody to come out.
Perfect. So we'll include that PFLAG. Thank you, Dick, for that list. I've got a whole list of resources. I'll make sure and links that we'll be including in that resource package. So we'll make sure everyone gets that. Okay.
Thank you for your help.
Thank you. So that's a really positive note, I think, to end on, because I think it reminds us to be thinking about what each of us can be doing individually within our communities, within our organizations, and looking broader at how we can improve what's happening for this population. So I wanted to say a big thank you to Julie for taking the time today to talk to us and to share this with us. We'll certainly be looking forward to that next report, as you said, that looks looks ahead in terms of some recommendations. And to everyone on the phone, thank you for taking the time to join us. I know Sarah Johnson put up a link there to our registration form. If you're not already connected with Niagara Connects and you want to kind of know about future events like this that we put on, we do send out a weekly e-newsletter that highlights events happening all across Niagara, learning events, community events, as well as new resources, community blogs, partners that are added to the Niagara Knowledge Exchange each week. So I encourage you to stay connected with us. And in the meantime, you'll be hearing from us in the next week or so with a really, really packed resource package. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy your afternoon, and we'll be speaking with you all soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Wonderful. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.